In that distant year of 1902, when the first rays of morning light pierced through the mist of Tang village in Jinghai County, Jili Province, a life destined to witness the final chapter of history quietly descended upon this world. Sunday Youting, this name was unremarkable at the time, as ordinary as the reeds swaying in the wind at the village entrance. However, the threads of fate had long been weaving an enormous net in the invisible realm, waiting to sweep this swaddled infant into a historical torrent spanning millennia. Tang village sat deep in the North China Plain, where the land was as barren as an old piece of paper bleached by time. The village was surrounded by endless saline alkali fields, with occasional scrawny willow trees dotting the ridges between fields. Their branches swayed feebly in the northern cold wind, as if telling tales of this land's poverty and helplessness. The Sunday family's thatched cottage stood at the southwest corner of the village, the thatch on the roof already yellowed, rustling in the wind, a sound that seemed both like a sigh and some ancient prophecy. Sunday Youting was the second of 4 brothers. His father was a typical North China farmer, his face etched with wrinkles carved by wind and sand, his hands roughened like tree bark from years of labor. The family's mere 7/10 of an acre of poor farmland was utterly inadequate in those times, completely unable to feed a family of 6. Whenever night fell and the feeble glow of the kerosene lamp flickered in the thatched hut, Father Sunday would always sit at that worn-out 8 immortals table, repeatedly calculating the family's income and expenses with his calloused hands, his brow tightly furrowed, as if trying to carve all his worries onto that weathered face. However, on this barren land, a flower of hope unexpectedly bloomed. The village tutor was a down-and-out scholar, and his private school was set up in a dilapidated temple at the east end of the village. This tutor, seeing that Father Sunday was an honest man, made him his tenant farmer, and in exchange allowed Sunday Youting to study at the private school for free. Those were the most wonderful 4 years of Sunday Youting's life. Every morning at the first light of dawn, he would carry a school bag sewn from coarse cloth and walk through the dew toward that dilapidated temple. Inside the temple stood a weathered statue of Emperor Wenchang, whose eyes appeared particularly profound in the dim light, as if able to see into the heart of every young student. Sunday Youting always sat in the last row, where the light was dimmest, but his eyes always sparkled, greedily absorbing the sweet nectar of knowledge. The private tutor was a thin old man whose voice, though not loud, rang remarkably clear in that humble classroom. When he swayed his head and chanted, "At birth, man is inherently good," Sunday Youting would always follow along in a soft voice, those ancient words flowing between his lips and teeth, as clear and sweet as mountain spring water. He learned to read, learned to write, and more importantly, he learned to think. During those long winter afternoons when other children were playing outside, Sunday Youting would sit alone in the temple, practicing calligraphy by the faint light. His small hand gripped tightly that brush worn very short, leaving childish but neat characters on the paper, stroke by stroke. However, just as Sunday Youting was immersed in the ocean of knowledge, an ancient and cruel system was casting its shadow from the depths of history. Eunuch, this word carries too much blood, tears, and humiliation. Its origins can be traced back to the distant Xia and Shang dynasties, when people called them inner ministers, temple servants, or palace officials. In that distant era when the first hereditary dynasty was established on the land of China, rulers faced an eternal dilemma: how to ensure the purity of royal bloodlines. This question hung over every monarch's head like the sword of Damocles, constantly threatening the stability of the dynasty. Thus, a seemingly perfect solution emerged: castration. This technique was originally used on livestock. Farmers discovered that castrated cattle and horses would become more docile and easier to fatten. When rulers creatively applied this technique to humans, they thought they had found a once-and-for-all solution. Those castrated men would forever lose the ability to carry on their family line, and thus could safely serve in the inner palace without worrying that they might contaminate the royal bloodline. Starting from the Western Zhou dynasty, eunuchs became an indispensable part of the imperial court. They were responsible for delivering messages, managing internal affairs, and attending to the daily lives of royal family members. In the eyes of rulers, these people were both loyal and safe, perfect tools for maintaining the stability of imperial power. However, they never considered what kind of pain and trauma this system would bring to those who were forced to undergo castration. Just as Sunday Youting was finding his own place in the world of knowledge, fate once again showed its cruel face. The tutor's employer went bankrupt due to poor management, and this news struck the Sunday family like a bolt from the blue. Having lost his job as a tenant farmer, Father Sunday became penniless overnight, and Sunday Youting had to bid farewell to that dilapidated temple and those books that fascinated him. From then on, the Sunday family's life took a sharp turn for the worse, and they soon fell to the point of surviving by begging. Whenever night fell, the family would gather under that flickering kerosene lamp, sharing the scraps of food they had begged for during the day. Sunday Youting looked at his parents' increasingly haggard faces, and waves of indescribable bitterness welled up in his heart. He began to understand that in this world, although knowledge is precious, it cannot fill an empty stomach. Although words are beautiful, they cannot ward off the cold. During those days of hunger and cold, Sunday Youting often thought back to his time at the private school. He would recall the teacher's gentle voice, the rhythm of those ancient characters, and the joy he felt when he first wrote neat handwriting. However, these beautiful memories seemed so fragile in the face of cruel reality, like fallen leaves in the autumn wind, easily scattered away. As time went on, the Sunday family's situation grew worse and worse. Father Sunday's body grew weaker day by day due to long-term malnutrition, and Mother Sunday became gaunt and haggard from worry. Watching their 4 sons grow up day by day, yet unable to provide them with basic necessities of life, the couple's hearts were filled with despair. During those long winter nights when the children had all fallen asleep, Father Sunday and Mother Sunday would often sit on the edge of the Tang, talking in low voices. Their voices were soft, but in the quiet of the night they sounded especially clear. They discussed every possible way out, but every path seemed to lead nowhere. Sell land. They had no land left to sell, go out to find work. In those times, what kind of job could a farmer find? In this atmosphere of despair, an ancient way out began to surface in their minds. In the rural areas of North China, legends about palace eunuchs had never ceased. People said that although those who entered the palace as eunuchs had to endure tremendous pain, once they gained a foothold in the palace, they could live a life free from want, and might even bring glory to their ancestors. Once this idea took root in Father Sunday's mind, it grew wildly like weeds. He began secretly inquiring about related information, learning about the procedures and requirements for entering the palace. Whenever he thought about making his son endure such pain, a sharp ache would surge in his heart. But when he saw the hungry faces of his children, this pain would be replaced by an even deeper despair. Spring came especially early in 1914, but for the Sunday family, this spring brought no hope whatsoever. After a long and hungry winter, Father Sunday finally made up his mind. On a dark and windy night, he called Sunday Youting to his side and stroked his son's hair with his trembling hands. "Youting," his voice choked up, "Dad is sorry to you, but we really have no other choice." Although Sunday Youting was only 12 years old, he had already vaguely understood what his father meant. During those hungry days, he had heard the villagers' whispers and knew that some families would send their sons into the palace to become eunuchs. He looked at his father's pained expression, and a wave of complex emotions surged in his heart. He was both afraid of the impending pain and felt a strange sense of pride at being able to help his family escape their predicament. "Dad, I understand." Sunday Youting's voice was young, but unusually firm. "If this can make life better for our family, I am willing." Hearing his son's words, Father Sunday could no longer control his emotions, and tears poured out like a bursting dam. He held Sunday Youting tightly, as if wanting to keep this son he was about to lose in his arms forever. On that quiet night, father and son embraced and wept together, their tears mixing and dripping onto the worn-out Kang mat, making a faint sound that seemed especially mournful in the silent night. The gears of fate began to slowly turn, and the last victim of an ancient system was about to be born. And in the distant Forbidden City, those magnificent golden palaces still stood quietly in the night, waiting to welcome their final servant. In the spring of 1914, when peach blossoms quietly bloomed across the North China plain, the Sunday family's small courtyard was shrouded in a deathly silence. It was a seemingly ordinary spring afternoon, sunlight streaming through the worn window lattice into the room, casting mottled shadows on the floor. Yet on this most unremarkable of days, a cruel ritual that would change Sunday Youting's fate forever was about to begin. Father Sunday had begun preparations 3 days earlier. He had sold off the last few valuable items in the house: a copper water pipe, a pair of silver bracelets from Mother's dowry, and that ancestral 8 immortals table. The money was used to purchase items needed for the surgery: several sharp razors, some hemostatic herbs, and large quantities of white cloth strips. Each item was carefully wrapped by him, as if preparing for some sacred ritual. The village knife master was a mysterious figure. His surname was Wang, around 50 years old, with a thin build, always wearing a blue cloth shirt washed so many times it had turned pale. His gaze was deep and cold, as if he had witnessed too much human suffering and had long become numb to it. In the rural areas of North China, people like him were not uncommon. They possessed an ancient and cruel craft, specializing in performing castration surgeries on boys who wished to enter the palace. Wang the knife master arrived at the Sunday household at dusk. He didn't say much, just silently inspected the tools he had brought. Those blades gleamed under the dim lamplight, emanating a chilling coldness that made one shudder. His movements were skilled and precise, clearly having performed this surgery countless times before. This surgery, known as purification, has a long and bloody history. As early as the spring and autumn and warring states periods, this technique was already quite mature. Ancient medical text recorded various castration methods. Some used ropes to strangle, some used drugs to corrode, and others directly cut with a knife. Each method was accompanied by immense pain and an extremely high mortality rate. According to historical records during the Qing dynasty, the mortality rate for civilian castration surgeries was as high as 21%. This meant that out of every 5 boys who underwent the surgery, 1 would lose their life on the operating table. Even those lucky enough to survive still faced threats from various complications such as infection, bleeding, and urinary blockage. However, for those desperate, impoverished families, this 21% mortality rate seemed like an acceptable risk, because the remaining 79% represented a chance to change their fate. Wang the knife craftsman's skills were said to be passed down from his master, and his master had learned them from an even earlier master, passed down generation after generation like this. A relatively complete surgical procedure had been formed. First, one had to choose the right timing, usually in spring or autumn, because the weather was neither too cold nor too hot at these times, which was beneficial for wound healing. Second, one had to prepare sufficient medicinal materials, including Sankey powder for stopping bleeding, Coptis for reducing inflammation, and opium for pain relief. The surgery was scheduled for the early morning of the next day. During this long night, Sunday Youting lay on the kang, eyes open, staring at the smoke-blackened rafters on the ceiling. Moonlight filtered through the window lattice and fell on his face, casting deep shadows on that young countenance. His heart was filled with mixed emotions, both fear of the unknown pain and longing for his future life. Mother Sunday sat at the edge of the kang, gently stroking her son's hair with her rough hands. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she held them back, not letting them fall. She knew that at this critical moment, she had to appear strong and couldn't let her son see her weakness. Youting, her voice was as soft as a feather. Tomorrow you are going to become a different person. Ma knows it'll hurt, but you have to hold on for our family and for your own future. Sunday Youting nodded, his throat seemingly blocked by something. Unable to speak, he recalled the verses he had read at the private school, remembered what the teacher had once said. When heaven is about to confer a great responsibility on a man, it first tests his resolve, exhausts his muscles and bones. Perhaps this was the trial heaven had given him. In the adjacent room, Wang the knife master was making final preparations. He wiped each of the sharp instruments clean one by one, then placed them on a white cloth. Those instruments gleamed under the candlelight, as if telling of the mission they were about to fulfill. His face showed no expression, like a craftsman about to complete his daily work. At dawn, when the first rays of sunlight had just pierced through the morning mist, the surgery began. Sunday Youting was carried to a wooden board in the center of the main hall, his limbs bound tightly. Wang the knife master stood beside him, holding a sharp razor in his hand, its blade glinting coldly in the dim light. "Child, clench your teeth. It'll be over soon." Wang the knife master's voice was terrifyingly calm, as if what he was about to perform wasn't a cruel surgery, but an ordinary haircut. Sunday Youting bit down hard on the wooden stick in his mouth, a resolute gleam flickering in his eyes. He knew that from this moment on, his life would be completely changed. He would lose certain characteristics of being a man, but would also gain a completely new identity and future. The instant the blade sliced through, intense pain struck Sunday Youting's nerves like lightning. That kind of agony was beyond words, as if tens of thousands of needles were piercing his body simultaneously, as if flames were burning through his veins. His body convulsed involuntarily, cold sweat rolling down his forehead like rain. Knife Master Wang's movements were swift and precise, the entire process lasting only a few minutes. When the surgery ended, Sunday Yaoting had already fallen into a semi-conscious state. Knife Master Wang skillfully bandaged his wound, then sprinkled some hemostatic powder on it. "The next 3 days are critical," Knife Master Wang said to Father Sunday. "Don't let him drink water, don't let him urinate. The wound must be kept dry. If he can urinate normally after 3 days, it means the surgery was successful. If not, he didn't finish, but everyone understood what he meant. The next 3 days were absolute hell for the Sunday family. Sunday Yaoting lay on the kang, unconscious most of the time. His face was pale as paper, his lips cracked and dry, his breathing so faint it was barely audible. Fever would strike, making his body burn like a furnace. Chills would descend, leaving him trembling like an autumn leaf. Sunday's mother stayed by her son's side day and night, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a wet towel. She didn't dare to sleep, afraid that if she closed her eyes for a moment, her son would leave her. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face filled with anxiety and fear. Whenever Sunday Yaoting let out a painful moan, her heart ached as if it were being cut by a knife. Sunday's father paced back and forth in the courtyard, his face filled with regret and self-blame. He began to doubt whether his decision was right, began to worry whether he would lose this clever son. Whenever the night was deep and quiet, he would kneel in the courtyard, praying to the starry sky, begging the heavens to protect his son and help him get through this ordeal safely. During these 3 days, Sunday Yaoting's consciousness drifted between clarity and haziness. When he was lucid, he could feel the intense pain from his body, a suffering that almost made him want to give up on life. But when his mind was hazy, he seemed to enter another world, where he saw magnificent golden palaces, saw royal family members dressed in gorgeous attire, saw himself walking through the palace, wearing eunuch's clothing. Just as Sunday Yaoting was struggling on the edge of life and death, news that shook the entire land of China arrived. Emperor Xuantong Puyi announced his abdication. The imperial system that had lasted for over 2,000 years officially ended, and the Republic of China was established. This news spread like a bolt from the blue to every corner of the North China Plain, and also reached Sichuangtang village in Jinghai County. When Father Sunday heard this news, his face instantly turned pale as paper. He realized that if the emperor was gone, what use would eunuchs be? His son had endured such immense pain. Was it all ultimately for a future that didn't exist? However, fate seemed to be playing a cruel joke on the Sunday family. Just the day after the news of the Qing dynasty's fall arrived, Sunday Yaoting miraculously made it through the danger period. His high fever subsided, his wounds began to heal, and most importantly, he was able to urinate normally. This meant the surgery was successful, he had survived. When Sunday Yaoting first opened his eyes and saw his mother's haggard, but joyful face, he knew he had been given a second chance at life. Although he had lost something, he had also gained new possibilities. He didn't know what kind of future awaited him, but he knew that no matter what, he had to live on with strength. The success of the surgery didn't mean the end of suffering. On the contrary, it was just the beginning of another kind of pain. As his body gradually recovered, Sunday Yaoting began to realize the profound impact this surgery had brought him. His voice started to change, becoming high-pitched and lacking masculine depth. His physique also began to subtly transform, his muscles becoming soft, his bones becoming slender. More importantly, there was the psychological trauma. Sunday Yaoting began to realize that he was no longer a complete man, and this realization was like a sharp sword, piercing deep into his soul. He became quiet and withdrawn, often sitting alone in the courtyard in a daze, his eyes revealing a melancholy beyond his years. The other children in the village began to look at him with strange eyes, and some would even point and whisper behind his back. Sunday Yaoting could feel the weight of these gazes like invisible shackles that made him feel suffocated. He began to understand that from now on, he would forever live under these strange gazes, forever bearing the pain of being an outsider. However, amidst this pain, Sunday Yaoting gradually developed an extraordinary resilience. He learned to endure, learned to find hope in suffering. He told himself that since he had already paid such a huge price, he must make this sacrifice meaningful. When Sunday Yaoting had fully recovered, The news of the Qing dynasty's fall was also confirmed. This news was undoubtedly a huge blow to the Sunday family. They had originally thought their son could enter the palace and enjoy wealth and glory, but now they discovered that the imperial court no longer existed. However, fate always seemed to be full of unexpected twists, although the Qing dynasty had fallen. According to the articles of favorable treatment of the Qing house, Puyi could still live in the Forbidden City, retain the title of emperor, and continue to use eunuchs. This meant that although the great Qing dynasty had become history, court life could still continue to some extent. This news brought a glimmer of hope to the Sunday family. Although the situation was different from what they had initially imagined, at least Sunday Yauting's sacrifice wasn't completely meaningless. They began to replan for the future, thinking about how to get Sunday Yauting into this scaled-down court. During those long days of recovery, Sunday Yauting often thought back to the night before the surgery, remembering his mother's gentle touch, remembering the tears in his father's eyes. He knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead, he couldn't let down his family's expectations, couldn't let his suffering become meaningless. When spring came again, Sunday Yauting had fully recovered. He stood in the courtyard, looking at the peach blossoms blooming once more, and a complex emotion welled up in his heart. These flowers were just as beautiful as last year's, but the person looking at them was completely different now. He knew that from now on, he would embark on a completely different path in life, a path full of unknowns and challenges. In the autumn of 1916, when the parasol tree leaves began to turn yellow, 14-year-old Sunday Yauting finally set off on his journey to Beijing. It was a season full of symbolic meaning, all things withering, yet also nurturing new hope. The horse-drawn carriage slowly moved along the bumpy dirt road, every inch of ground crushed by the wheels telling the story of this ancient empire's vicissitudes, from Jinghai County to Beijing City. This journey of less than 200 li felt to Sunday Yauting like a long voyage from one world to another. He sat in the corner of the carriage, gazing through the worn curtain at the scenery flying past outside. The North China plain appeared exceptionally vast under the autumn sunset. Distant mountains like indigo, nearby waters like mirrors. Occasionally a few returning birds swept across the sky, letting out long, drawn-out cries. Accompanying him to Beijing was a distant relative from the village who did small business in the capital city and knew a little about the palace affairs. Along the way, he kept telling Sunday Yauting various legends about the Forbidden City, those magnificent golden palaces, those strictly hierarchical rules, and those old eunuchs who had lived in the palace for decades. Yauting, this relative lowered his voice and said, "Once you enter the palace, it is nothing like being at home. The rules there are too many to count. One wrong look, one wrong word could bring death upon you. You must always remember, in there, you are no longer the second son of the Sunday family, but a slave of His Majesty the Emperor." Sunday Yauting nodded silently, his heart filled with both longing for the future and fear of the unknown. The surgery 2 years ago had completely changed the trajectory of his life, and now he was about to step into a completely unfamiliar world, one full of opportunities but also full of dangers. When the carriage finally entered capital city, it was already evening. The ancient city walls looked particularly majestic under the glow of the setting sun, and those city bricks that had weathered hundreds of years of wind and rain seemed to be telling the glorious history of this city. Careful observers could easily notice that this former imperial capital was undergoing unprecedented changes. The streets no longer had only traditional carriages and sedan chairs. Occasionally, a few Western-style automobiles could be seen driving by, belching black smoke. Traditional Chinese people wearing long robes and Mandarin jackets brushed past modern figures, dressed in Western suits and leather shoes, as Eastern and Western cultures blended together here in a wondrous way. Shop signs displayed both traditional Chinese characters and new style slogans, and the entire city presented a complex appearance of old and new in transition. The Forbidden City still stands at the center of Beijing, its red walls and yellow tiles gleaming in the sunset, as if proclaiming their former glory to the world. However, keen observers could sense that this palace complex was undergoing a subtle decline. Though its exterior remained magnificent, its inner vitality was gradually dissipating, like a beautiful flower that still maintained its outward form. Yet its life force was quietly slipping away. According to the articles of favorable treatment of the Qing Imperial House, although Puyi had abdicated, he could still reside in the inner court of the Forbidden City, retain the title of emperor, and continue to use the original palace staff. This arrangement created a peculiar historical phenomenon Within a republican nation, there still existed an emperor and his court. When Sunday Youting first stood before the Meridian Gate of the Forbidden City, he was deeply struck by the sight before him. That towering gate tower rose high into the sky, its red walls appearing especially solemn in the sunset. The yellow glazed tiles on the gate tower sparkled under the sunlight. As if paved with gold, a huge plaque hung in the center of the Meridian Gate, with the words Meridian Gate written in both Manchu and Chinese. The characters were bold and powerful, exuding an inviolable majesty. Several guards in yellow riding jackets stood before the gate, their expressions stern and their gazes sharp, as if they could see through the heart of every person entering or leaving the palace gate. Sunday Youting followed his guide through the Meridian Gate and entered the Gate of Supreme Harmony Square. It was a massive stone-paved plaza, surrounded by buildings with red walls and yellow tiles. The Hall of Supreme Harmony stood at the northern end of the square, its roof featuring the highest-grade double-eaved hip roof, displaying its supreme status. In this square, Sunday Youting truly felt the majesty of imperial power for the first time. Every detail of those buildings told stories of power, and every stone bore the weight of history. He began to understand that what he was about to enter was not just a palace, but a small society filled with complex rules and hierarchies. In the Qing dynasty's palace system, eunuchs had a strict hierarchy. The highest were the chief eunuchs, usually only one or two, who reported directly to the emperor and managed the entire palace's internal affairs. Next were the head eunuchs of each palace, who were responsible for managing specific palaces and departments. Below them were ordinary eunuchs, who carried out various specific service duties. Eunuchs of each rank had different clothing, living quarters, and treatment. High-ranking eunuchs could wear magnificent clothing, live in relatively comfortable rooms, and enjoy rich meals. Lower-ranking eunuchs could only wear plain clothes, live in shabby dormitories, and eat simple food. This hierarchy was reflected not only in material treatment, but also in daily behavioral norms. Lower-ranking eunuchs had to bow when meeting higher-ranking ones, use honorific language when speaking, and give way when walking. Any behavior violating the hierarchical order would be severely punished. As a newly entered young eunuch, Sunday Youting was naturally at the very bottom of this hierarchy. He was assigned to an old eunuch called Little Dejang, and began his palace life. Although Little Dejang had little in his name, he was actually a man in his 50s who had served in the palace for over 30 years and knew all the palace rules like the back of his hand. In this palace, rules are life. Little Dejang warned Sunday Youting on his first day in the palace. You must remember every movement here, every word, even every glance, has its rules. Break the rules, and at best you'll get beaten, at worst you'll lose your life. The rules of the palace were indeed dazzlingly numerous. Walking had its own rules. You couldn't stride too fast or drag your feet too slow, but had to maintain a gait that was neither showy nor slack. Speaking had its own rules too. Different titles and tones had to be used for people of different ranks, and not the slightest mistake was allowed. Even the most basic daily routines of eating and sleeping had strict regulations. The eunuchs had to wake up at 4 in the morning every day, first wash up and tidy themselves, then attend morning exercises. They would begin the day's work with only very short breaks in between. They had to go to bed at 9 in the evening, with no exceptions whatsoever. Sunday Youting's first task was to learn how to bow properly. In the palace, different occasions required different bows, and meeting people of different ranks also required different bows. Sometimes it was a simple nod of acknowledgement, sometimes a deep bow, and sometimes even kneeling prostration was required. Each type of etiquette had precise movement requirements. Being off by even a fraction of an angle was unacceptable. Little Dejang was a strict master, and his demands on Sunday Youting were nearly harsh. Whenever Sunday Youting's movements were even slightly off, he would point it out without hesitation, sometimes even rapping Sunday Youting's knuckles with a ruler. In the palace, close enough means far from enough, he often said. The eyes of His Majesty, the Emperor, and the consorts are sharp as snow. Not a single small mistake can escape their notice. After several months of training, Sunday Youting gradually adapted to the rhythm of palace life. He was assigned to work near the Hall of Mental Cultivation, mainly responsible for cleaning and delivering messages. Although the work was relatively simple during this process, he began to truly understand the inner workings of this palace. The Hall of Mental Cultivation was Puyi's main residence, where everything maintained the traditional royal style. The furnishings inside were extremely luxurious, with precious antiques and artworks everywhere. Portraits of emperors from past dynasties hung on the walls, while exquisite porcelain and jade objects were displayed on the tables and desks. Every item had profound historical significance, telling the glorious past of this dynasty. However, behind this surface splendor, Sunday Yaoting also sensed a deep melancholy and helplessness. Although Puyi still retained the title of emperor, his power had been severely diminished. He could no longer rule the entire country like previous emperors, and could only live a semi-secluded life within this palace. This contradictory situation was also reflected in the daily life of the court. On one hand, traditional etiquette and rules were still strictly enforced, and everyone had to act according to the ancient hierarchy. On the other hand, changes in the outside world were constantly impacting this ancient palace, and new ideas and concepts were quietly seeping in. In the palace, Sunday Yaoting became acquainted with several young eunuchs around his age. They had all entered the palace in recent years and shared similar experiences and circumstances. When these young men gathered together, they would often talk about the changes in the outside world, discuss their pasts and their hopes for the future. Among them was a eunuch called Little Lai, who had entered the palace a year before Sunday Yaoting, and was quite familiar with the palace situation. He told Sunday Yaoting that although palace life seemed stable for now, it was actually full of uncertainty. "The outside world is changing too fast," he often said. "Who knows how much longer we can live like this?" There was also a eunuch called Little Wang, whose family was fairly well off. He didn't enter the palace because of poverty, but because of family tradition. His grandfather and father had both served in the palace, so he had a deep understanding of palace life from a young age. He often told others about the history and traditions of the court, those stories about emperors of previous dynasties, those legends about palace intrigues. Among these young eunuchs, there was both friendship and competition. They all hoped to gain a better position in the palace and enjoy better treatment. But at the same time, they knew that in this strictly hierarchical system, any one person's rise meant fewer opportunities for others. This delicate relationship meant their friendships always carried a hint of caution and reservation. China in 1916 was at a major historical turning point. The outside world was undergoing earth-shattering changes, with new ideas, new technologies, and new ways of life challenging traditional social structures. However, within the ancient palace of the Forbidden City, time seemed to have stood still, everything remaining as it was hundreds of years ago. This contrast left a deep impression on Sunday Yaoting's heart. When he conducted himself according to ancient etiquette in the palace, he knew that beyond the palace walls, people were pursuing completely different ways of life. This awareness made him think more deeply about his situation. Was he pursuing a bright future, or clinging to a past destined to disappear? Sometimes in the quiet of the night, Sunday Yaoting would stand on the palace rooftop, gazing at the distant lights. Those lights represented the prosperity and vitality of the outside world, while the palace he was in, though magnificent, seemed so lonely and isolated. He began to understand that the path he had chosen was destined to be lonely, and he would spend his entire life in this ancient palace, witnessing the end of an era. However, even facing this realization, Sunday Yaoting did not regret his choice. He knew that no matter how the outside world changed, he could no longer turn back. He could only walk firmly down this path, leaving his mark in this special historical period in his own way. The winter of 1918 came exceptionally early. Snow began dancing in the sky above the Forbidden City at the beginning of November. Those hexagonal ice crystals drifted down as gently as feathers onto the red walls and yellow tiles, draping this ancient palace in a silvery white coat. On days like this, the entire Forbidden City seemed extraordinarily quiet, as if time itself had slowed its pace here. Sunday Yaoting had been living in the palace for over 2 years now, and both his body and mind had undergone significant changes. At 16 he was slender and willowy, his delicate features carrying a composure beyond his years. The long period of palace life had made his mannerisms elegant and cautious, every movement revealing traces of thorough training. His voice had completely lost its masculine depth, becoming high-pitched and clear, a permanent change brought about by the castration surgery. On this cold winter afternoon, Sunday Yaoting was organizing documents in a side hall of the Hall of Mental Cultivation. This was the new work he had recently been assigned. Though still considered a lower-level task, it was already somewhat more important than simply cleaning. Most of these documents were daily palace records, including various expense accounts, personnel transfer notices, and some correspondence from the outside world. Through these documents, Sunday Yaoting began to gain a deeper understanding of how this palace operated. He discovered that, although Puyi was nominally still the emperor, his life was actually subject to many restrictions. The court's financial situation was also not as comfortable as it appeared on the surface, and many expenses required careful budgeting. This realization gave Sunday Youting a more realistic understanding of the environment he was in. During this long winter, Sunday Youting's relationship with his master Xiao Dezhang became even closer. Xiao Dezhang was a wise old man who had served in the palace for over 30 years, experiencing the entire historical period from Emperor Guangxu to Puyi. He had witnessed the final glory of this dynasty, and also watched its gradual decline. Youting, on a snowy night, Xiao Dezhang sat by the stove and said to Sunday Youting, "Do you know what is most important in this palace? It is not being clever nor being diligent, but endurance. You must learn to endure loneliness, endure grievances, endure those seemingly meaningless rules. Only by learning to endure can you survive here." Xiao Dezhang's words sent Sunday Youting into deep thought. He began to understand that the essence of palace life was not about enjoying wealth and glory, but a special form of cultivation. Here, everyone had to learn to suppress their own personality and adapt to a complex and strict code of conduct. Although this way of life could bring a certain sense of security and belonging, it also meant great restrictions on personal freedom. Little Dezhang also told Sunday Youting many historical stories about the palace. He spoke of Empress Dowager Cixi's majesty and wisdom, of Emperor Guangxu's tragic fate, and of those eunuchs who rose and fell in court struggles. These stories gave Sunday Youting a deeper understanding of palace life and made him realize the uniqueness of his position in history. "People like us," Little Dezhang often sighed, "are neither fully men nor fully women. We exist somewhere in between. This identity allows us to survive in the palace, but it also destines us to loneliness. We serve the imperial family, but can never truly become members of it. We live in the most magnificent palaces, yet our hearts are the most barren." As a servant in the hall of mental cultivation, Sunday Youting had the opportunity to observe Puyi's daily life up close. This last emperor was only 12 years old at the time. At a critical stage of transition from childhood to adolescence, his life was bound by strict etiquette and rules, with each day's schedule precisely arranged, leaving almost no time for free activities. Puyi's day began at 5 in the morning. First came washing and dressing, a process requiring the assistance of several eunuchs, with strict procedures for every step. Then came the morning court session. Although there was no real state affairs to handle anymore, this ceremony was still maintained, mainly to preserve the emperor's dignity and tradition. The morning was usually study time. Puyi had several Han and Manchu tutors who taught him classical literature, history, and calligraphy. Sunday Youting could often hear the clear sounds of reading coming from the study room. Those ancient poems echoed through this ancient palace, as if telling the story of civilization's inheritance. The afternoon was Puyi's free time, but this freedom was relative. He could stroll in the imperial garden, play some traditional games, but there were always eunuchs and guards accompanying him. Sunday Youting noticed that this young emperor often had a longing look in his eyes, as if yearning for the world beyond the palace walls. Evening was mealtime. Puyi's dinner was extremely lavish, usually consisting of dozens of dishes. But Sunday Youting discovered that this young emperor actually had a small appetite, and most of the food would go to waste. This waste seemed particularly glaring in China at that time, because the outside world was experiencing war and famine. Although the Qing dynasty had already fallen, within the Forbidden City, various political forces were still engaged in subtle power plays. These forces mainly included conservative Manchu nobles, remnants hoping for restoration, and some reformist figures trying to adapt to the new era. They engaged in fierce debates over Puyi's education and future direction. The conservatives hoped that Puyi would receive education entirely in the traditional manner, studying classical culture and maintaining Manchu traditional customs. They believed that only this way could preserve the dignity of the imperial family and prepare for a possible restoration in the future. Most of these people were elderly Manchu nobles who held strong resistance toward changes in the outside world. The reformists believed that Puyi should receive modern education and learn Western science, technology, and political systems. They thought that only by adapting to the changes of the times could the imperial family find its place under new historical conditions. Among these people were some young Manchu nobles as well as some Han Chinese intellectuals. This kind of debate was visible everywhere in the daily life of the court, from the arrangement of Puyi's curriculum to his choice of clothing, From court etiquette standards to methods of external interaction, every detail could become a focal point of contention between different factions. As a low-ranking eunuch, Sunday Yaoting couldn't directly participate in these debates, but he could feel this tense political atmosphere. 1918 was a year full of changes. World War I was about to end, and China, as a member of the Allied powers, saw its international status somewhat elevated. At the same time, the new culture movement was rising nationwide, and traditional Confucian culture was facing unprecedented challenges. Although these changes mainly occurred outside the palace walls, they were constantly influencing life within the Forbidden City. Through those letters and newspapers that came from the outside world, Sunday Yaoting learned about the tremendous changes happening in the world beyond. He read about discussions on democracy and science, read about calls for women's liberation, read about proposals for educational reform. These new ideas and concepts formed a stark contrast with the traditional education he had received in the palace. Sometimes when Sunday Yaoting was sorting through these documents late at night, he would feel a deep sense of confusion. He didn't know what he should believe in, what he should pursue. Traditional values told him to be loyal to the Imperial family and obey the hierarchical system, while new ideas told him to pursue personal freedom and dignity. This inner conflict caused him pain and also made him start thinking about the meaning of his own life. In this era full of changes, Sunday Yaoting's companions were also making different choices. Little Lai became increasingly negative. He believed palace life had no future and often expressed dissatisfaction with the current situation. He began secretly contacting the outside world, trying to find opportunities to leave the palace. Little Gui chose a completely opposite path. He studied palace etiquette even harder and more actively tried to please his superiors, hoping to achieve a higher position in the palace hierarchy. He believed that no matter how the outside world changed, palace life was always relatively stable and safe. There were also some eunuchs who chose a middle path. They neither completely rejected new ideas nor completely abandoned traditional values. They tried to find a balance between the two, able to adapt to the changes of the times while still surviving in the palace. These different choices reflected the common dilemma faced by Chinese people of that era: how to find one's place between tradition and modernity, how to maintain one's identity in changing times. For Sunday Yaoting, this question seemed particularly complex because his special identity meant he could neither fully integrate into traditional society nor easily embrace modern life. During this winter, Sunday Yaoting's inner world underwent profound changes. He began to think more deeply about his identity and fate, about his place in this changing era. He realized that he was not merely a eunuch, but a witness to history, someone who personally experienced the transitions of an era. This realization gave him a new understanding of his situation. He began to see his experiences as a special historical experience, to see his pain and confusion as the inevitable price of changing times. Though this understanding couldn't completely eliminate the pain in his heart, it gave him the courage and meaning to continue living. Sunday Yaoting began to observe every detail of palace life more carefully, to record what he saw and heard more seriously. He realized that he was experiencing a unique historical period, and this experience might hold important value for future generations. This realization gave his life new purpose and motivation. During those long winter nights, when snowflakes quietly drifted outside the window, Sunday Yaoting would often sit under the lamp and think. He thought of his parents back home, thought of that spring that changed his fate, thought of this path he had walked, full of pain, but also full of meaning. He knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead, he had to keep going, leaving his mark on history in his own way. When the spring of 1919 arrived, the ice and snow in the Forbidden City began to melt, and the flowers and plants that had been covered by snow all winter revealed their green sprouts once again. This natural revival brought new vitality to the palace and also brought new hope to Sunday Yaoting's heart. In this spring, Sunday Yaoting was promoted to deputy steward of the Hall of Mental Cultivation. This was the first official promotion he had received since entering the palace. Although this position was still not very high, for a 17-year-old young eunuch, it was already quite an achievement. This promotion not only meant better treatment and greater authority, but more importantly, it represented recognition of Sunday Yaoting's abilities and character. This promotion gave Sunday Yaoting new hopes for the future. He began to believe that as long as he worked hard and served loyally, he could find his place in this special world and realize his own value. This belief gave him the motivation to keep moving forward, and also gave him firmer confidence in the path he had chosen. In the autumn of 1924, the city of Beijing was shrouded in an atmosphere of unease. Parasol tree leaves drifted down in the bleak autumn wind, as if foretelling the great upheaval about to come. For 22-year-old Sunday Yaoting, this autumn was destined to become one of the most important turning points in his life. He had already lived in the Forbidden City for 8 years, growing from a naive youth into an experienced palace steward, yet the wheels of history were about to crush everything he knew. On a morning in October, when the first rays of sunlight filtered through the latticed windows of the Hall of Mental Cultivation and fell upon the floor, Sunday Yaoting was organizing documents from the previous day. These documents contained increasingly unsettling news. The political situation outside was deteriorating rapidly. Conflicts between various warlords were intensifying, and attitudes toward the Qing court were undergoing subtle changes. Feng Yuxiang's army had already taken control of the capital city. This warlord, known as the Christian General, held a strong opposition to the traditional imperial system. He believed that continuing to maintain an emperor in a republican nation was a desecration of democratic ideals and a stumbling block to national progress. This view gained support from many progressive figures and also laid the groundwork for the upheaval to come. Sunday Yaoting could feel the increasingly tense atmosphere inside the palace. Those usually dignified senior eunuchs began to frequently gather together and whisper, their faces filled with worry and unease. Some well-informed people had already begun secretly preparing escape routes, quietly transferring valuable items to safe places. The entire Forbidden City seemed like a building about to collapse, with everyone worrying about their own future. The 5th of November, a day of special significance in Chinese history, had finally arrived. The morning sunlight still gently fell on the red walls and yellow tiles of the Forbidden City, but this tranquility was soon shattered. A squad of armed soldiers suddenly appeared in front of the Meridian Gate, their military boots striking the stone pavement with uniform and heavy sounds, as if they were the footsteps of history marching forward. The leading officer held an official document in his hand, an eviction order signed by Feng Yuxiang. The content of the document was brief yet stern. Puyi must leave the Forbidden City immediately, and all palace personnel must pack their belongings within 3 hours and leave forever this palace where they had lived for many years. This news struck the entire court like a bolt from the blue, leaving everyone stunned by this sudden turn of events. Sunday Yaoting was working in the side hall of the Hall of Mental Cultivation at the time. When he heard the commotion coming from outside, an ominous premonition welled up in his heart. He put down the documents in his hands and quickly walked to the window, seeing those fully armed soldiers through the lattice. At that moment, he knew the world he had lived in for 8 years was about to completely collapse. The news quickly spread throughout the entire court. The eunuchs ran around in panic, some packing their belongings, some searching for hidden valuables, and others standing frozen in place, not knowing what to do. Those usually majestic palaces now seemed so fragile, as if a gust of wind could blow them down. Sunday Yaoting watched all of this, and a complex mix of emotions welled up in his heart: fear of the future, nostalgia for the past, and an inexplicable sense of relief. In this chaotic moment, Puyi displayed a calmness and dignity beyond his years. Although this 18-year-old last emperor must have been filled with pain and reluctance inside, he still maintained the dignity befitting royalty on the outside. He summoned all the senior eunuchs in attendance and held a brief yet solemn farewell ceremony in the Hall of Mental Cultivation. "Everyone," Puyi said in his clear yet slightly trembling voice, "we have lived together here for so many years, and today we must part ways. Although we are about to leave this palace, the bond between us will never change. I hope everyone can find their own way out and take care of yourselves in your new lives." These words brought tears to everyone present. Sunday Yaoting looked at this young emperor who had grown up in the palace since childhood, and a deep sense of sympathy and respect welled up in his heart. He knew that for Puyi, leaving the Forbidden City meant not just losing a residence, but losing his identity, his dignity, and the meaning of his existence. After the farewell ceremony ended, Puyi began packing his personal belongings. He selected some of his most precious books, calligraphy, paintings, and mementos, while everything else had to be left behind in the palace. Sunday Yaoting was assigned to help Puyi pack, and during this process, he saw the pain and helplessness in the young emperor's eyes. Those items that once symbolized supreme power now appeared so fragile and powerless. As the eviction order was carried out, hundreds of palace staff began their journey of departure. Among them were old eunuchs who had served for decades, young attendants who had only recently entered the palace. technical personnel responsible for various specialized work, and guards in charge of security. Each of them faced the same predicament: how to start their lives anew in a completely unfamiliar world. For those elderly eunuchs, this upheaval was especially cruel. They had lived in the palace for most of their lives, and apart from court etiquette and service skills, they knew almost nothing about the outside world. More importantly, their special identity made it very difficult for them to find a suitable place in ordinary society. Many could only barely scrape by on the meager savings they had accumulated over the years, with a very bleak future ahead. Although the younger eunuchs were more adaptable, the challenges they faced were no small matter either. They needed to learn new life skills, adapt to a new social environment, and rebuild their network of personal relationships. For someone like Sunday Youting, who had received some education and had management experience, the situation was relatively better, but even so, the road ahead was still full of uncertainty. Little Dejang, Sunday Youting's old master, was already a man in his 60s by this time. When he dragged his heavy luggage out of the Meridian Gate, his figure looked especially aged and lonely. Sunday Youting caught up to him wanting to help, but the old man waved his hand and said in a trembling voice, "Youting, let's each take care of ourselves. This world is changing too fast, and US old bones can't keep up anymore." When Sunday Youting walked through those familiar palaces for the last time, 1,000 emotions welled up in his heart. Those red walls and yellow tiles were still beautiful under the glow of the setting sun, but they were about to lose their former masters and become an empty museum. Those grand halls that once echoed with imperial majesty were about to welcome the curious gazes of tourists and the flash of cameras. He passed by the Hall of Supreme Harmony, that building symbolizing the supreme imperial power, now appearing so lonely. He passed by the Hall of Mental Cultivation, where his 8 years of work memories and growth footprints remained. He passed by the Imperial Garden, where the flowers, plants, and trees had witnessed his transformation from a youth to a young man. Every place carried his memories, every corner told the story of an era's end. Before the Meridian Gate, Sunday Youting turned back for one last look at this palace. As the sun set in the west, golden light spilled over the ancient buildings, making everything appear so beautiful yet melancholic. He knew this farewell might be forever, and he would never return here as a court attendant again. This palace would become a part of his memories, an important and special chapter in his life. The moment he stepped out of the Meridian Gate, Sunday Youting felt as if he was walking from one world into another. Behind him was the familiar and enclosed palace life. Ahead was the unfamiliar and open modern society. This transformation was both terrifying and exciting. He didn't know what awaited him, but he knew he had to bravely face this challenge. After leaving the Forbidden City, Sunday Youting temporarily stayed at a small inn in the capital city. This was his first time truly experiencing ordinary social life in 8 years, and everything made him feel amazed and astonished. The inn housed all kinds of people: merchants, students, workers, vagrants. They came from different places, had different stories, and lived completely different lives. This diversity was an eye-opener for Sunday Youting. In the palace, everyone's identity and status were fixed, and behavioral patterns were highly standardized. But here, people could freely express their opinions, choose their own lifestyles at will, and change their fate based on their own abilities and efforts. This freedom, though bringing chaos and uncertainty, was also full of vitality and possibilities. Sunday Youting began learning how to survive in this new environment. He needed to learn how to bargain, how to deal with all kinds of people, and how to find his place in an environment without strict hierarchies. These skills were entirely new challenges for someone who had lived in the palace for 8 years. What shocked him most was the rapid changes in the outside world. There were more cars and trams on the streets, all kinds of novel goods appeared in shops, and newspapers were filled with discussions about political reform and social progress. This world seemed to be changing every day, yet he felt like someone who had traveled from another era. After staying at the inn for a few days, Sunday Youting began to seriously consider his future. His savings were limited, and he couldn't rely on them to live indefinitely. He needed to find a job and establish a foundation for his life in this new society. However, for a eunuch, this was not an easy thing to do. His special identity made him face many difficulties when looking for work. Many employers were prejudiced against eunuchs, considering them remnants of the old era, unsuitable for work in modern society. Even those employers without obvious prejudice often had doubts about eunuchs' abilities and loyalty. However, Sunday Youting also had his own advantages. He had received a good education, could read and write, and had some management experience. More importantly, the meticulous, cautious, and loyal character he had cultivated in the palace was valuable in certain jobs. He began to look for job opportunities where he could leverage his strengths. After several days of effort, Sunday Youting finally found a job at an antique shop. The shop owner was a middle-aged man with a deep interest in traditional culture, and he believed that Sunday Youting's palace background and cultural refinement were exactly what he needed. Although the salary wasn't high, it was at least enough to maintain a basic living, and more importantly, it gave Sunday Youting the opportunity to continue engaging with and learning about traditional culture. During his days working at the antique shop, Sunday Youting gradually adapted to the new pace of life. His main duties were to assist the shop owner in appraising the authenticity and value of antiques, receive customers who came to buy or sell antiques, and maintain the daily operations of the shop. Although these tasks were different from his experiences in the palace, his cultural background and keen observation skills allowed him to quickly become competent at this job. However, the process of adapting to his new life wasn't always smooth. Sunday Youting would often unconsciously display traces left by his palace life: overly formal speech and manners, instinctive reactions to hierarchical order, and a lack of understanding of certain modern concepts. These characteristics sometimes made him seem out of place when interacting with customers or colleagues. What was even more difficult was the psychological adjustment. In the palace, although Sunday Youting's life was subject to many restrictions, it also had clear goals and meaning, serving the royal family and maintaining traditions. In his new life, he needed to redefine his own value and goals. This identity crisis often left him feeling lost and pained. In the quiet of the night, Sunday Youting would often think back to his life in the Forbidden City. Those strict rules, those magnificent palaces, those companions he lived with, all became precious fragments in his memory. Although that life had various restrictions and hardships, it also gave him a sense of belonging and security. Now, he had to move forward alone in a world full of uncertainty, and this loneliness sometimes felt unbearable. A few months after starting his new life, Sunday Youting unexpectedly ran into several old companions on the street. These reunions made him feel both joy and sadness, because everyone's circumstances were different. Some had adapted well, while others had fallen into difficult situations. Little Lee had found a job as a clerk at a foreign trading company. He was very adaptable and quickly fit into the new environment. He told Sunday Youting that although the new life had many challenges, it also had many opportunities. The key was to dare to change yourself and embrace the new era. The little prince's situation was not so good. He had never been able to adapt to life outside the palace and always missed the old days. He had found several jobs, but none lasted long, and now he was living by selling small items he had brought out from the palace. His eyes were full of confusion and despair, like an ancient person lost in the modern world. Some eunuchs chose completely different paths. Some used their palace background to open private schools, teaching traditional culture. Some became antique dealers, making a living with their professional knowledge, and some even changed their identities, trying to start anew in the new society. These different choices gave Sunday Youting a new understanding of his own situation. He realized that everyone must choose a path suitable for themselves based on their own circumstances and abilities. There was no standard answer, nor an absolutely correct choice. What mattered was having the courage to face change and the wisdom to adapt to the environment. After several months of experiencing his new life, Sunday Youting had a clearer understanding of his future. He realized that he couldn't forever immerse himself in nostalgia for the past, nor could he completely abandon his history and identity. He needed to find a way to both adapt to the new era and maintain his own characteristics and value. He began to more actively learn new knowledge and skills, while also cherishing his traditional cultural background more. He discovered that in this rapidly changing era, although traditional culture had been impacted, it still had unique value and charm. Many people began to re-examine the meaning of traditional culture, seeking the intersection of modernity and tradition. This realization gave Sunday Youting a new plan for his future. He no longer saw himself as someone abandoned by the times, but rather as a bridge between tradition and modernity. He believed that with his experiences and abilities, he could find his own place in this new era and realize his own value. The great upheaval of 1924, while ending Sunday Youting's palace life, also opened a door to a new world for him. Amidst pain and struggle, he began a new chapter in his life, embarking on the difficult transformation from palace eunuch to modern citizen. From 1925 to 1949, these 24 years were the most complex and turbulent period in Sunday Youting's life. From age 23 to 47, he experienced the life transition from youth to middle age, and also witnessed China's historical upheavals from warlord conflicts to the War of Resistance against Japan, and then to the War of Liberation. In this era of constant change, he was like a small boat tossing in the torrents of history. Yet he always maintained his inner resilience and love for life. During his years working at the antique shop, Sunday Yaoting gradually established his own social network in the capital city. His palace background and cultural refinement earned him a certain reputation in the antique world, and many collectors and cultured people were willing to associate with him. This elevation in social status gave him more confidence and also gave him a more positive outlook on his future. However, good times don't last forever. In 1928, with the victory of the Northern Expedition and the relocation of the nationalist government northward, Beijing's political status underwent a fundamental change. Many high-ranking officials and nobles moved south, and the antique market declined accordingly. The antique shop where Sunday Yaoting worked saw its business plummet and eventually had to close down. This turn of events once again put him face to face with the challenge of survival and made him deeply realize the close relationship between personal fate and the changes of the times. After losing his job, Sunday Yaoting didn't get discouraged. Using the connections he had built up over the years, he started working as an antique broker. He shuttled between various collectors, helping them buy and sell antiques and earning commissions from the transactions. Although this work didn't provide a stable income, it gave him more freedom and allowed him to come into contact with more cultural treasures and historical stories. In 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident broke out, and the Chinese nation entered the difficult period of full-scale resistance against Japan. After Beijing fell, the entire city was shrouded in the shadow of war. For ordinary citizens like Sunday Yaoting, how to survive in the chaos of war became the most pressing issue. After the Japanese army occupied Beijing, they implemented strict control policies. Many cultural relics and historic sites were destroyed, and a large number of antiques and cultural artifacts were plundered. Sunday Yaoting watched these precious relics carrying Chinese civilization being barbarically looted and destroyed. His heart filled with anger and pain. He began secretly participating in activities to protect cultural relics, using his professional knowledge and connections to help some important artifacts avoid being plundered by the Japanese army. This kind of activity was full of danger, but Sunday Yaoting believed it was his responsibility and mission. He had lived in the Forbidden City for 8 years and deeply loved traditional Chinese culture. Now, when these cultural heritages faced catastrophe, he couldn't stand by and do nothing. He carefully cooperated with some like-minded friends, protecting and relocating cultural relics through various means, preserving many precious cultural heritages for future generations. During the war, living supplies were extremely scarce, and Sunday Yaoting's life became exceptionally difficult. He had to sell some of his smaller antique collectibles to make ends meet, and sometimes even had to rely on friends' help to get through tough times. But even in the most difficult moments, he never gave up his commitment to culture and his longing for a better life. In 1945, when news of victory in the War of Resistance against Japan arrived, the entire city of Beijing was in an uproar. Sunday Yaoting stood on the street, watching people cheering and celebrating, feeling a long-lost excitement and hope welling up in his heart. This war that had lasted 8 years had finally ended, and the Chinese nation had finally welcomed the dawn of victory. Post-war reconstruction brought new opportunities to the antique industry. Many cultural relics that had been lost during the war began to reappear on the market, and the collecting world gradually regained its vitality. With his professional knowledge and honest business practices, Sunday Yaoting regained his footing in this recovering market. He not only restored his pre-war standard of living, but also accumulated a certain amount of wealth. However, the good times didn't last again. The outbreak of the Chinese Civil War plunged the society that had just regained peace back into turmoil. Many wealthy merchants and collectors began transferring their assets, and the antique market fell into depression once more. Although Sunday Yaoting was affected to some extent, he had already learned to adapt to changes and persevere through difficulties. In 1949, when the People's Liberation Army entered the capital city, Sunday Yaoting was already a 47-year-old middle-aged man. He had experienced too many upheavals and setbacks, and witnessed too many historical changes. Facing this new era, he had both expectations and worries, but more than anything, there was a calmness and composure that came from having weathered many storms. After the founding of New China, Sunday Yaoting faced yet another major choice and adaptation in his life. This new regime's attitude toward traditional culture and remnants of the old society was different from any previous government, which made him feel both curious and uneasy. As a former palace eunuch, he didn't know how he would be treated in this new society, or what fate awaited him. To his surprise, the new government didn't take harsh measures against people like him. On the contrary, due to his rich cultural knowledge and deep understanding of traditional artifacts, he was invited to participate in some cultural relic protection and organization work. This feeling of being needed helped him rediscover his own value and gave him a more positive view of the new society. In 1950, Sunday Yaoting was hired as a consultant for the Palace Museum, specifically responsible for assisting in organizing and researching Qing Dynasty court artifacts. This position gave him the opportunity to return to the Forbidden City. Although his identity was completely different now, that familiar feeling still made his heart surge with emotion. Walking through those familiar palaces, he felt as if he had returned to his youthful days, and those dusty memories came flooding back. During his days working at the Palace Museum, Sunday Yaoting played an important role. Drawing on his experience of living in the palace, he provided valuable first-hand information about the origins, uses, and historical backgrounds of many artifacts. His recollections and accounts helped researchers better understand the details of daily life and cultural significance of the Qing Dynasty court, preserving precious historical information for future generations. As he grew older, Sunday Yaoting became increasingly aware of his unique value as a witness to history. He was one of the last people to have personally experienced life in the Qing Dynasty court, and his memories preserved the true face of a world that was about to disappear. Encouraged by some historians and cultural workers, he began to systematically organize and recount his experiences. In the 1960s, Sunday Yaoting began accepting interviews from scholars, recounting in detail his life experiences in the palace. These interview records became important historical materials for studying Qing Dynasty court history and the eunuch system. His accounts were vivid and detailed, covering everything from daily routines and meals to major historical events, from personal emotional experiences to the process of social change, all with deep and unique observations. These oral histories possess not only academic value but also significant humanistic value. Through Sunday Yaoting's accounts, people can gain a more authentic understanding of the living conditions and inner world of that special group, and can more deeply comprehend the complexity and diversity of traditional society. His story has become a bridge connecting the past and present, allowing future generations to better recognize and understand history. After entering the 1970s, Sunday Yaoting's body began showing signs of aging, but his spirit remained vigorous. He lived a simple and regular life in a small courtyard house in Beijing, reading, writing, organizing materials every day, and occasionally receiving scholars and cultural workers who came to visit. This peaceful life gave him the opportunity to deeply reflect on his life experiences and historical significance. He began attempting to write some memoirs recording his life journey from childhood to old age. Although his writing wasn't particularly elegant, his accounts were authentic and moving, filled with insights about life and reflections on history. In these recollections, Sunday Yaoting gained a more objective and profound understanding of his own life. He no longer felt pain and shame about his special identity, but instead viewed it as a unique experience bestowed upon him by history. He believed that everyone has their own mission and value, and the key is to do one's best in one's position, leaving something meaningful for society and future generations. On the 17th of December 1996, 94-year-old Sunday Yaoting peacefully passed away in Beijing. His death marked the complete end of an era, because he was the last eunuch in Chinese history, the final witness to that ancient system. Sunday Yaoting's life spanned nearly a century, witnessing China's great transformation from a feudal society to a modern one. He experienced the fall of the Qing dynasty, the establishment of the Republic of China, the victory of the War of Resistance against Japan, the founding of New China, and the beginning of reform and opening up. In this magnificent historical process, he was a participant, a witness, and a recorder. Although his life was full of pain and setbacks, it was also full of resilience and wisdom. Through his experiences, he tells us that no matter what difficulties and challenges we face, people should maintain their love for life and hope for the future. Through his perseverance, he tells us that the value of traditional culture will not disappear with the changes of the times. They will find new ways of expression and meaning of existence under new historical conditions. Sunday Yao-Ting's story has become an important part of China's modern history, and his experiences and testimony provide precious materials for future generations to understand that special historical period. His life trajectory reflects the changes of an era and also embodies an individual's perseverance and adaptation in the torrent of history. When night falls, when the dust of history slowly settles, Sunday Yao-Ting's story still tells the true face of that bygone era. His life is like a living history book, recording the profound changes in Chinese society and witnessing the complexity and beauty of human nature. In this rapidly changing world, his story reminds us to cherish history, respect tradition, and at the same time bravely face changes and adapt to the development of the times.